Welcome to the Educational Forum. This program is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law at Andover. Here at the Massachusetts School of Law, we held a conference to discuss some of the issues facing our world in regard to global climate change. On this show, we discuss threats to biological diversity and human health. Our panelists are Professor Pat Parenteau. Professor Parenteau is a professor of law and the senior counsel in the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Clinic at the Vermont Law School. He is a nationally recognized expert on the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, National Environmental Policy Act, and other environmental laws. He has been involved in drafting, litigating, implementing, teaching, and writing about these laws for over 30 years.
The only thing scarier, actually, than reading the IPCC's reports is opening your 401k plan right now. Do you realize this week, us investors lost $100 billion? We're living beyond our means. We are. The problem with climate and the problem with the financial market is the same thing. You can't eat your principal. You can't eat your feedstock. You have to live on the income from your investments and the income from your labor. And when it comes to nature, you have to live on natural capital. And what we're doing to the planet is we're eating and consuming the natural capital of the earth. All of the environmental problems that we've seen in the past were tiny little bite-sized problems. They looked huge. Acid rain looked like an enormous problem. Contamination of groundwater from hazardous waste sites looked like a huge problem. Water quality problems looked really, really difficult. And then we found out about ozone-depleting chemicals that were punching enormous holes in the stratosphere, letting in ultraviolet radiation, causing havoc not only with humans, but with the entire natural world, amphibians across the planet, in every sector of the globe, in places that are clean and free of pollution, declining in catastrophic numbers. But climate change is the big kahuna. This is the civilization betting gamble. One of the first things that we're going to need to deal with climate change is a new kind of democracy, a new kind of leadership. It's going to be the same kind of democracy and leadership we're going to need to deal with this economic crisis we're facing. But here's the difference. We are going to get through this economic crisis. I don't know how long it's going to take for the markets to settle down, for confidence to be restored, for the banks to be recapitalized. I don't know which plan is going to work. Plan A, the $700 billion bailout, didn't work. Plan B, the reduction of interest rates, didn't work. Plan C, now, I hear on NPR on the way down, is you and I are going to start buying banks. You have to go back to the Civil War, folks, to think about what we're talking about doing. Nationalizing banks in the United States of America? I thought they only did that in Russia. But when you start talking about buying ownership interests in banks, that's what you're talking about. The kind of leadership that we're going to need, calm, confident, reassuring, resolute, disciplined, vigorous, open to new approaches, dropping the ideology, government is the problem, not the solution. But we're also going to have to drop the ideology that the market is bad, that the market can't work, that the market can't be fixed or can't be improved, because we can't deal with climate change unless we have both strong, healthy, intelligent, forward-thinking government leadership, and the same goes for the leadership in the private market. The corruption and the greed that we saw bringing down Wall Street, I mean, that's got to end. Technology is hugely important to this problem. There's no mistaking that. And in a moment, I'm going to turn to some of the technologies we're talking about. using, and policies, are critical to dealing with the threat, the surpassing threat of climate change. There's hope when the G8 get together and start trying to agree on what can we do together collectively to confront a financial crisis that's affecting all of us. We're all in the same boat, the leaders of the world are saying, and the same is true of climate change. So we're in a post-Kyoto mode right now. The Kyoto Protocol, which we never ratified, will expire in 2012. Kyoto by itself is, as we say in Vermont, a pea hole in the snow when it comes to dealing with climate change, but at least it's a start. It was a weak, puny start, but a start. But post-Kyoto, the next round of Kyoto negotiations, well, that's the ball game. That's the ball game. Because if we don't get all the nations of the world on board with an effective plan to deal with climate change, it's not going to happen. This year, according to the U.S., the International Information Agency Authority, China surpassed us in greenhouse gas emissions. We were the leader, first place for a long time. China has now surpassed us. China is adding 2 coal plants per week to the national grid. India just got a massive loan from the World Bank to build the Tata coal plant, 2,000 megawatts, and that's just for openers. We have to have an international agreement with the developing nations of the world. They're not going to join an international agreement until we, the United States, get serious. Our per capita greenhouse gas emission is 6 times the per capita emission of China, even though China, as I say, is now the leader. It's even more than that when it comes to India. At the same time that we have to exhibit leadership on getting our own energy consumption under control, which I'll talk about in a minute, we have to export the technology. We have a vested interest in China because most of our manufacturing base that's left the United States, you've heard all this through the election season, which never seems to end, all the jobs lost, all the outsourcing. You know where all that manufacturing base that used to be in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan is? I'll tell you where it is because I've seen it. It's in Guangdong Province, China. That's where it is. That's where it is. American goods that used to be manufactured in Ohio are now manufactured in Guangdong. And all those coal plants that I mentioned, they're being built to make the goods that we're all buying right now. So we have a vested interest in what's happening in China, in what kinds of energy systems they're building, what kinds of pollution control devices they're installing, what kinds of institutional mechanisms they have to ensure that the systems they're actually installing are actually performing. Because the latest MIT study on the operation of Chinese coal plants suggests they could be doing tremendously better at managing their emissions than they are because they have no institutional capacity in the country to do it. Coal. Let's start with coal. 51% of our electricity comes from coal. The electricity sector is 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. Coal is slated to become an even greater portion of our portfolio. In China and India, it's 80% of their portfolio. Coal now moves all over the world. It's a world commodity. Its price is set by demand around the world. Coal from the Powder River Basin of Wyoming is being burned in Guangdong Province. And so, what do we do with coal? The United States has over 200 billion tons of coal in the ground. We're called the Saudi Arabia of the world when it comes to coal. Projections are we have enough coal to supply us with electricity for 200 years. But we also know that coal is the most CO2-intensive fuel on the planet. And we know some other things about coal that are going to make this choice, which I'm going to frame for you, exquisitely painful. Cradle to grave, from mining to disposal, there is no energy source on the planet worse than coal. Think about it. Have you ever seen the pictures of mountaintop removal in the Appalachia? Do you know where the coal that's being burned in New England is coming from and the electricity that most of us are getting is coming from? Go to the websites and look at the pictures of what's happening to the communities in Appalachia. Then move along the coal life cycle to combustion. I already said it's the largest single source of CO2. But that's not the only thing it's a source of. SO2, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, precursors of not only acid rain, but ozone, precursors of PM 2.5, fine particles that bury themselves deep in lungs. Coal-fired power plants, according to EPA's data, are responsible for over 30,000 premature deaths per year in the United States, in the Northeast, from exposure to fine particulates. How about mercury? Coal-fired power plants, largest single source of mercury on the planet. What does methyl mercury do? Bioamplifies up the food chain. Who's the end receptor? Mothers. Fetuses. Fetal counts of methyl mercury are climbing. Premature deaths, impairment of mental faculties. Centers for Disease Control has documented empirically all of these things and traced them directly to the burning of coal. There are other kinds of emissions. Move to the disposal end of the spectrum. What are we doing with coal waste, combustion waste, fly ash and combustion waste? Heavily toxic, heavy metals, organics, inorganics, toxins of every kind and description. Do we regulate them as hazardous waste? We do not. We do not. For the same reason we allow mining companies to blow the tops off of mountains, we're not about to confront the political power of the coal lobby and regulate their waste the way it ought to be regulated, as hazardous waste. And what's the consequence? More and more studies showing groundwater contamination, contamination of drinking water supplies. How many times are we going to destroy a drinking water source before we don't have any more drinking water sources that we can rely on, even with the expenditure of enormous sums to try to clean them, filter them, treat them? Now, what do they mean by clean coal? And what kind of choice does it present us? What they're talking about is a new type of combustion process, number one, gasification. IGCC, supercritical, goes by many different technological acronyms and names. Go to the websites, you'll find tons of information on all of it. No question about it. Gasification technology, if you're going to burn coal, is the way to go. Much more efficient. Does deal with many of the emissions, including mercury, at a very high level of removal. But all it does with regard to carbon dioxide is separate it, concentrate it, and release it to the atmosphere. So if all you did was gasify coal combustion, you'd make climate change worse. The only way that you can truly call this new process clean is if you capture the CO2, you condense it, you purify it, and you pipe it to places where you can put it in the ground at about a mile or 800 meters under the ground, finding geologic formations like deep salt domes, where there's a cap rock over the top of it to keep it there forever. Now, that's what they're talking about. It's called carbon capture and storage or sequestration, geologic sequestration. Do we do it today? Yes. We do it to recover oil and gas. It's called Enhanced Oil and Gas Recovery, EOR. if we want to burn all of the coal in the United States, and if we want to burn all of the coal in the rest of the world, we're not talking about millions of tons of CO2. We're talking trillions of tons of CO2. Billions just in the United States. Billions of tons of CO2. Now, the way the technocrats talk about this is it's a scaling problem. Yeah. It's a problem of scaling up the known technologies so that they can deal with these massive quantities that we've never before dealt with. And by the way, the oil and gas recovery is done for oil and gas recovery. It isn't done to trap CO2 forever. It's done for oil and gas recovery. So whatever experience we have, and that's the only experience we do have with this kind of injection, is it's for a very specific purpose, not the purpose for which we now are talking about sequestration. Because the studies show that if you lose, if as little as 1% of the sequestered CO2 escapes, leaks, you have wiped out the benefits for the climate of the whole sequestration program. Less than 1%. So our systems have to be accurate and verifiable and effective to a 99% plus level of confidence. And you forget things about liability and what if it goes wrong and who's it, those are all enormous problems and legal questions that people are wrestling with. But here's the point. As bleak as I may be trying to make this sound, there's probably no reason to believe that we're not going to, in fact, burn this coal. It would take a heroic assumption. What does dangerous interference with the climate mean to science? Can science tell us, in quantitative terms, in a simple, clear metric that everyone can understand, what does that term mean, dangerous interference with the climate? And the IPCC labored long and hard and came up with a consensus view that we think we can avoid dangerous interference if we limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius this century. But even at that rate, which has been pointed out already, many very knowledgeable, credible, sober scientists have said is way too high for irreversible damage to the ecosystems on Earth and serious threats to human health and safety all over the world. Of all the things that I've heard about in terms of impacts of climate change on biodiversity, it's this one, ocean acidification. The loading of the oceans with carbon is triggering a change in the pH of ocean chemistry. Just try to get your head around that. Corals are calcium. So it's destroying the coral systems by destroying their ability to bind calcium. That means all the shell-forming creatures in the ocean are being affected the same way. Shrimp, lobster, all the way down through the marine food web. This is an area that hasn't received nearly as much investment in scientific study as sea level rise, catastrophic wildfires, erosion, flooding, increasing storm intensity, particularly tropical Atlantic storms like Katrina, glacier melt, snowpack melt. All those other things are receiving enormous amounts of study, and reports come out every day on how bad all that is. But the ocean acidification problem is not very well understood, and yet it's terrifying to behold. So coal and sequestration, what are we going to do? Are we really left with no choice? That's what the argument is. We have no choice. We've got to build coal. Or nukes. So let's go to nukes for a minute. Now, I used to fight nukes, but nukes are at the table. There's no question about it. If you're serious about forestalling the worst consequences of climate change, you simply can't rule out nuclear power. You just can't. If you read the science, if you take it to heart, you can't. I don't care how many problems there are with nuclear power plants. The one thing that they don't have in terms of their emissions is carbon dioxide. There's no argument about that. So what are you going to do with the nuclear option, though? The lead time for nuclear plants is 10 to 15 years in this country. France has 70% of the electricity from nuclear, so they've made a huge bet on nuclear. Well, in this country, it's 10 to 15 years to build a nuclear power plant. They're, fiendishly expensive. They're way, way beyond coal or oil or natural gas or wind or solar or any other form of energy. They're just fiendishly expensive. And even with an indemnity, even with a cap on liability, which we call the Price-Anderson Act, they're still a high-risk adventure. It only takes one accident. When the 3 Mile Island accident occurred, that ended the nuclear industry in the United States of America. Not a single nuclear plant was ever put online after that accident. Now they're starting to come back. 20 or so applications are pending at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and there will be more. Some of those are going to get through, some of those are going to get built. And in a world where we're told that the threat of terrorism is one of the highest threats that we have to face, and loose nukes and terrorists getting their hands on nuclear material is the greatest of all the dangers, you have to take on board the increased risk and security that's going to be required to maintain a nuclear fleet of power plants in the United States and around the world moving all this material. So that's another tough choice. How about wind? To just quickly move along and maybe talk about some options that are a little more pleasant to think about. Well, we know that there is enough wind potential in the Great Plains of the United States to meet all the electrical needs of the United States, period. There's enough wind blowing down through the Great Plains where I grew up, and I can vouch for the fact that there's a lot of wind out there, to power the United States. T. Boone Pickens knows that. That's why he's proposed 100,000 windmill turbines throughout the Great Plains. He wants an Apollo-level project, Apollo program project, to build wind over the next 10 years. Al Gore's speech when he said we can be on renewables in 10 years relies very, very heavily on wind. But you folks in Massachusetts know how difficult it is to build wind plants. Off the coast anyway, near Nantucket anyway, and Martha's Vineyard anyway. In Vermont, we have the same thing. 3 commercial wind projects have gone down to defeat because Vermonters are very jealous about their ridge lines. But if you're talking about energy supply, and you wanted to avoid all these nasty consequences of coal and nuclear that I've tried to sketch for you, well, then obviously wind has got to be, a major component of that. So you do need an Apollo program level investment, private and public investment, to break through the storage problem and the grid problem. We do not have a transmission system. Well, we don't even have a transmission system that's adequate for the existing fleet of conventional power plants, let alone wind energy. But here's where the new bridge technologies come into play. Plug-in hybrids. There's one on the market right now as we speak, Toyota, Prius. I got the first edition Prius in the parking lot. I love it. It's the best car I've ever had. It's getting 49 miles per gallon, 7 years and 150,000 miles later. But the next generation, the plug-in hybrids are the key, okay? So you plug them in at night when energy demand is low. You charge up the batteries. The batteries are good for 40 miles. That's 90% of the commuter distance in the United States, 40 miles. If you have a battery that can get you 40 miles, you will never put a drop of gas in it. That's plug-in hybrid. But it's also a storage system, do you see? If everybody in America had a plug-in hybrid, boom. Now you're talking, and you interface that with the grid, now you have a storage system, plus you have a transportation system, and you've gotten rid of petroleum. That's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about. Those kinds of bridge technologies, those kinds of massive breakthroughs. Solar photovoltaics going gangbusters. My friend Grow Solar, they went public. They are 3 years backlogged. 3 years backlogged. Why are they backlogged? They can't make solar panels fast enough. The demands for solar panels are so great, they can't make them fast enough to install them. But we know that photovoltaic panels are not the ultimate answer. How about solar thermal? California is building a 1,000 megawatts solar thermal power plant in the Mojave Desert. There's a lot of desert in the United States. There's also some desert tortoises in the United States, and you know what? We're going to lose some. And there's also a lot of beautiful deserts. The desert landscape is just mythical. If you've never really spent much time, it's mythical. It's beautiful. Carlos Castaneda, all that. But you know what? We're going to put a hell of a lot of solar panels and solar power plants in the desert. The greatest single source of electricity in the United States and in the world is efficiency. And there are two elements to efficiency. One is more productive use of the existing energy, and two is energy conservation. They're two different things. They're often confused. They're different, okay? Energy efficiency simply means getting more bang for your buck, making every molecule, calorie of energy do more, doing more with less. That's what energy efficiency means. What is the potential for energy efficiency? According to McKinsey & Company, which is the leading international, global, well-recognized, serious, sober, quantitative, economic type people, 50%, the world could reduce energy demand, or I should say improve energy efficiency, improve productivity by 50% by 2030 with an investment of trillions, which sounds like a lot of money, which would return 17%. Okay? In the United States, we can get to 50% with roughly a $7 billion per year investment. Our entire budget today for everything that's renewable and efficiency isn't even $1 billion. The one plant, the demonstration plant that they're talking about building to demonstrate this carbon capture and sequestration system I'm talking about, the prototype plant is over $1 billion. One plant, one prototype is over $1 billion. If you took all the money that you're talking about spending to burn coal cleanly and put it into energy efficiency, you would knock energy demand in half. If you took money from a trade and auction program of carbon dioxide emissions, such as we now have in the Northeast in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, had its first auction last month, took in $40 million. It was a big success for the first auction, and they're going to have another auction in December, and then they're going to have one every quarter following that. If you took the money nationally, you scale that program up nationally, and you start talking about auctioning off carbon dioxide emissions nationally, and you take those proceeds and you do two things with them. One, you give a rebate because it's going to be a price hit on each and every electricity consumer and other consumers in the United States. There's no getting around that. There's no free lunch. There's no pain-free way to deal with this. It's a lie to try to suggest that we're going to get out of this without getting hurt. We are going to get hurt. The question is whether we want to get hurt worse later, or put the hurt on somebody else later, or take the hit now for what we need to do. Take some of the money from these auction revenues, which are going to be in the billions, and do rebates, particularly for low-income people, to offset the price hit on fuel and electricity, but take the rest of it and put it into these breakthrough technologies. Because even a high price on carbon, even something like $30 per ton of carbon dioxide, is not going to put wind power on the grid. All we've got on the grid today are oil and gas and nukes and coal and hydro, and all of those are tasked to their max. So you can drive the price of carbon dioxide emissions as high as you want. You are not going to put non-carbon sources on the grid by doing that. The only way you're going to do that is invest in the breakthroughs in the technology and force both public and private investment into those more efficient and cleaner technologies. Are we concerned enough about the future? And do we take seriously our moral obligation to the future, to the people who come after us, not just our kids, but our kids' kids and their kids' kids? We've never been tested like this before. I hope and pray that we're up to it. But don't expect it to be easy or pain-free. It won't be. We've dug ourselves a very deep hole And the first rule of holes is, when you're in one, stop digging. Thank you.
Dr. Ilya Perlingeri. Perlingeri is the author of The Uterine Crisis, one of the first books to link environmental toxins with the staggering rate of women's reproductive illnesses. In 2006, she was chair of Maine's first global warming conference. She has written for E!, the environmental magazine, and London's The Ecologist. Dr. Perlingeri notes that the issues of a radically changing global environment caused by humans must be addressed now from the local level up.
What's happened to accelerate these changes? The issues surrounding climate change and all of that is multi-layered. It's extremely complex. It doesn't just mean dealing with the climate, but the whole of the biosphere. And we're at the top of a very, very toxic food chain. What I'd like to focus on today in my talk is how weather modification, which was mentioned just briefly in a question, is playing a major role in this rapidity of environmental changes, but also in the vast increases of illness. So let me set the stage with some background. I spent 15 years of independent research for my last book, which is called The Uterine Crisis. It is one of the first books to link the huge environmental crises that we have, multi-layered that they are, with women's reproductive problems. And they are staggering, from fetuses in utero all the way to elder women. Though I haven't done the research for you guys, you're not off the hook by any means, because sperm count is down by 50% with all the toxins in the environment. But what I learned with this research is, and it's a staggering figure, if you can even get your mind around it, is that we are exposed on a regular basis to 100,000 chemicals every single day. It depends on the spew, where you are, and I do mean a spew because it's a toxic spew. And most of these have never been tested for human safety. We're the guinea pigs for an experiment that is way out of control. And this is one of the reasons that we have high rates of cancer, although right now cancer is number 2, superseded by cardiovascular problems, which is now number 1, and asthma, which I will mention later, is number 3. In addition, there are 8,000 new chemicals that go online every year to which we're also exposed. 8,000. These two have never been tested for human safety. Chemicals and pharmaceuticals are tested one at a time, and because the way things are right now, there are very few independent labs and few independent scientists. So a lot of this is, as I say, the fox is guarding a scenario that's really pretty awful. And we have known really since the 30s, particularly for issues surrounding women's reproductive problems, that tampons were unsafe in the 30s, but a lot of things are covered up, and that has not changed in 70 years. So having the pharmaceutical companies test things or the chemical companies test things doesn't necessarily mean that we're safe if something's put online. In addition, these safety factors that the chemical and the pharmaceutical companies test for, they're testing one chemical at a time. This does not address what Dr. Theo Colburn in Our Stolen Future in 1996 addressed, and that is it's multiple. And one chemical plus one chemical does not equal 2. One chemical plus one chemical could equal, especially in hormone-disrupting chemicals, 1,600 times the dose. And we're all walking time bombs. That is a reality. Everybody in this room. Bill Moyers did a great, great show about 6 years ago called Trade Secrets, which is still available, I believe, on DVD, looking at this whole issue of the multiplicity of chemicals and the problems that, I should say, of greed have caused for Americans. And as I write in The Uterine Crisis, it's all about greed. It's not about our well-being and safety. And there are countless stories about the problems of people who have become critically ill or died, stories going back to the thalidomide crisis in the 60s and 70s, toxic shock syndrome, pesticide poisonings, which are really off the scale, even for small children, and Vioxx, just to name a few. It was on the market when they knew it was unsafe, and people were spending a fortune so that the companies could make billions of dollars. We are the guinea pigs in a huge and complex experiment where the health and environmental repercussions are absolutely staggering. Babies are now born with what is called the body burden. That is, while they're growing in utero in their mom's bodies, they are already getting a chemical body burden that is passed on through the umbilical cord. And so by birth, these poor, innocent children are already affected. And there are staggering rates of birth deformities, cancers, and other reproductive-related illnesses that we did not have 20 or 30 years ago. When I was growing up, there was no such a thing as a children's hospital. Think about it. We have children's hospitals all over. What has happened? What has happened? Just think about that figure. What does 100,000 chemicals mean in a mixture that is not even being tested in its vast mathematical complicity? We breathe chemicals every day. We eat food grown in heavily pesticided soil, soil that's greatly reduced in beneficial organisms and mineral content from 30 and 40 years ago. We drink water that is highly contaminated with other chemicals, including mercury, as Pat mentioned, and every other kind of spew that you can even imagine. Robert Kennedy Jr. has been working with several water conservation organizations, water keepers, over the last 30 years to try and even clean up the PCBs in the Hudson River. And there have been frequent reports of rocket fuel in mother's milk and found in lettuce. What is that doing in our food supply? Secondly, 30 years of environmental laws have been systematically destroyed over the last 8 years. Americans are exposed to many higher levels of toxins, including mercury, from power plant emissions, as Pat had mentioned, from cement factories, and from multi-prepared vaccinations, the latter of which has resulted in autism, high rates of autism, ADD, and other cognitive troubles. For centuries, we've known that mercury, probably thousands of years, that mercury is deadly. There is no safe level of mercury. Not at all. The Mad Hatter of Alice in Wonderland is based on the 17th and 18th century real Mad Hatters who died and went crazy before they did because of the use of mercury in making those tall hats that we see in historical paintings. There's no safe level, as I mentioned, of mercury. It takes decades to work its deadly action. And in a person's later years, brain function and cognition deteriorate and death ensues. I've seen it with my own mother, who was one of the leading dentists in the United States for 47 years. I've seen it with friends, and it's a pretty awful scenario to see somebody who was brilliant not even be able to communicate. Mercury is unsafe, and we are breathing it as we speak. Thirdly, in regard to climate change, there has been new research from several scientists just in this past year showing dwindling to no sunspot activity from our sun. The science is not perfect. We've heard from people earlier today saying it's a consensus and everything's always up for re-examination. But this lack of sunspot activity could indicate from several scientists. If you need the websites and the particular references, I'll be glad to give them to you after my talk. This might be indicating that we're entering what is known as a Maunder minimum that is similar to the ice age that was mentioned earlier during the 17th century. This may indicate that, in fact, maybe the climate is not getting warmer, but much cooler. We just don't know. This is all up for changes. I will say, living in Maine and having just moved from California, and that's another story, Maine this past winter had 16 feet of snow. It's the highest, most significant snow level that we've had since records began to be kept during the 1870s. So this is all something that it's still a process that we still don't know what's going to happen. Finally, the fourth issue are the brown clouds that we mentioned just earlier. Does anybody know about the brown clouds other than Dr. Young? 2 people. Okay, since last year and a little bit earlier, NASA has retrofitted a number of planes, and an international scientific team has been put together under Dr. V. Ramanathan at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. They are tracking, starting April last year, there was big articles in the Wall Street Journal and all over the West Coast, though it didn't seem to get the kind of attention I would have hoped. This international team has been tracking the pollution from India and from China, and the clouds really are brown, and I can tell you from living in California for 35 years that we don't see them here as much, but they're here because we're in a closed loop, and what affects one part of the country eventually comes around and hits other parts of the planet. But the pollution is filled with industrial pollution that includes soot, heavy metals, urban exhaust, power plant emissions, including more mercury, acid, ash from coal-fired plants, home heating stoves, and forest fires. The highly toxic pollution is measured in what are known as teragrams. 1 teragram equals 2.2 billion pounds of toxic soot and assorted other things that are coming here from China. It takes about a week, give or take, the weather. So in addition to our own pollution figures, we are now getting more than 40 billion pounds of pollution annually from Asia. And pollution figures have doubled over the last 20 years. The U.S. gets the heaviest load of these brown clouds during the springtime and less over the summer. This is a global issue, and we certainly as Americans haven't been stepping up to the plate. A survey report issued by the World Bank in 2007 estimates that there are about 460,000 premature Chinese deaths a year just from breathing polluted air and drinking poisoned water, although this was questioned by an official of China's State Environmental Protection Administration saying that it was baseless. However, the Financial Times and the Chinese government, which conducted this research in partnership with the World Bank, asked that the lender, that is the World Bank, not publish these estimates for fear that it could trigger social unrest. China is beset by growing public alarm about acid rain and toxic water, and has promised by 2010 to cut their pollutants by 10%, but even last year they failed to meet last year's measurements that they had done. The United States got its own shameful statistics, and I'd like to just give you some of them. Car emissions, which include benzene, which is highly toxic and causes cardiovascular problems and an elevated blood pressure, kills 30,000 Americans each year. The risk of cancer from breathing diesel exhaust that we breathe every day is about 10 times more than ingesting all other toxic pollutants combined, with diesel emissions contributing to over 70% of the cancer risk from air pollution in the United States. Third, we take the equivalent of smoking 20 cigarettes every day, even if we're non-smokers, just due to air pollution that we're breathing every second. The Boston area ranks number 5 in the country for premature deaths due to diesel pollution annually. And in the state of Massachusetts alone, diesel emissions are responsible for the following figures of annual statistics: 450 premature deaths, 700 non-fatal heart attacks, 9,900 asthma attacks, 13,000 respirator symptoms in children, and 60,000 lost workdays. According to the EPA, emissions from power plants contribute to over 2,800 lung cancers and deaths, and 38,200 heart attacks annually in the United States. So this is just a little bit of what we are dealing with in terms of figures of toxicity in the air that we breathe every day. This does not include weather modification. Ancient cultures used to do native tribal dances to pray for rain, to bring areas that were very dry and have good rainfall. In the 20th century, clouds were seeded by numerous countries around the globe with various chemicals to produce rain. China was just doing this over the summer in Beijing to make sure that there weren't any rain, that there wasn't any rain during the Olympics. But all this has changed dramatically with the U.S. military's secretive research and plans to control the planet's natural weather. This has not been given very much press, and we have to remember that we have a corporate-owned press where 85% of radio, television, and print media is owned by 5 corporations. So they're not going to talk about things that are of really serious consequence, and that's somewhat of the blessing, a mixed blessing of the internet, but there's certainly plenty of information on weather modification. The Air Force is on record as saying, quote, they want to control the weather by 2025, and we are not talking about just seeding the clouds for rain. Weather modification means, quote, any activity performed with the intention of producing artificial changes in the composition, behavior, or dynamics of the atmosphere, unquote. And as of April this year, there are more than 150 different weather modification programs around the world. Since about 2000, the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy have been spraying the entire United States sky with a toxic brew of chemicals and other biologic agents. Do we have that? Can we do that? Just want to show you something. We have 2 different kinds of trails in the sky right now. One are called contrails. How many of you know what contrails are? Contrails are what have been around from the ends of planes since World War II. These are very, very short exhaust trails that usually evaporate within a few minutes. You just look up at the sky and you'll just see a jet, sometimes with 4 trails, but it evaporates pretty quickly. How many of you know what chemtrails are? Nobody. The military and some commercial planes are spraying us with what are called chemtrails. I want you to look at the, and oftentimes before there's a weather front, there are heavy assaults from these planes just before a weather front is changed and comes in. Military and some commercial jets have been fitted with huge barrels of at least 49 different kinds of documented chemical poisons. Among other documented ingredients in this toxic man-made clouds are pathogenic molds, fungi, weaponized viruses, and made in some places like the secret site at Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is supposed to be a cancer site, but there are a number of scholars and professors tracking this that have big questions about this. Barium and nanoaluminum particles. What do these do to the human body? Barium is an alkaline earth mineral. It was discovered in 1774. At low doses, it can act as a muscle stimulant. At high doses, it detrimentally affects the heart and the nervous system. Barium is toxic to all mammals, and that means not just humans. Aluminum, which is the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust, is known to diminish kidney function, and destroy brain cells and cognitive function. Just think about it. Just between the aluminum and the mercury that we're breathing all the time, we've got already a serious issue about brain function and cognitive function. There is also documented evidence that the aluminum in chemtrails is released as nanoparticles, and that when they reach the Earth environment for wildlife, in lakes and streams, it's causing serious problems with wildlife there. Researchers are also finding that nanoparticles interfere with the growth of plants. Nanotechnology is totally unregulated. Just this past month, a new research report came out showing and documenting for the first time that these nanoparticles actually go through the skin. Well, if you breathe them, whether they go through the skin or whether you're inhaling them, it's still a problem, a serious problem. Other toxic chemicals that have been documented include ammonia, ammonium chloride, bismuth, cadmium, one of the most toxic elements also in the environment, hexabromobenzene, lead, potassium iodine, potassium perchlorate, sulfur, and xylene. This is just a toxic spew of carcinogens, serious respiratory and skin irritants, cardiovascular and gastrointestinal toxicants. I'm asking, is there a relationship between asthma, now the number 3 killer in the United States, and staggering rates of it for small children, up from number 10 a decade ago, and the chemtrails? According to Clifford Carnicom, who's been studying chemtrails for 9 years now, and I met with him to discuss this in detail this summer, quote, "The true nature of these aerosol operations remain undisclosed and closed to fair examination by the public. All of this is being done by stealth to keep us in ignorance." There is a long, long history in the United States, tragically, not the kind of history that you learn in college textbooks, about secret chemical exposure to which Americans were subjected. I'd like to read you just a few of them. In 1931, Dr. Cornelius Rhodes, under the auspices of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Investigations, infected human subjects with cancer cells. They were not told about it. He later went on to establish the U.S. Army Biological Warfare Facility in Maryland, Utah, and Panama, and then was named to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. While there, he began a series of radiation exposures, experiments on American soldiers and civilians in hospitals. In 1942, Chemical Warfare Services began mustard gas experiences on approximately 4,000 servicemen. The experiments continued until 1945 and made use of the Seventh-day Adventists who chose to become human guinea pigs rather than serve on duty. 1965, prisoners in a prison in Philadelphia were subjected to dioxin. Dioxin is so toxic, it is a byproduct of chlorine when it breaks down, whether it's in Clorox or in tampons, and a teaspoon could literally kill the entire planet. Dioxin is a carcinogen, and it's part of Agent Orange. That was suspected even before the military used it for Desert Storm. In 1996, the Department of Defense admits that Desert Storm exposure for all of the military, they were exposed to chemical agents, including Agent Orange. So I have questions that have to be part of an urgently needed public discussion and outcry. When is this going to stop? Obviously, you don't know, and I would urge you, they're outside. There's a list of websites that you can go to, not just to Clifford Carnicom's, but this is the most, his website is the most well-documented one with lots of medical information. I've talked to over 100 doctors just in this past 6 months, naturopaths, MDs, all sorts of people in healthcare, and there we have staggering rates of upper respiratory and cardiovascular problems that we never used to have. There's a brand new emerging field, and that's called environmental cardiology, and they're not even dealing with the issues of weather modifications and chemtrails. I'd like to know, how are the real drought conditions by nature exacerbated by a constant spew of aerosols in the chemtrails? How much of global warming or climate change is actually caused by billions of tons of these aerosols that have been sprayed over us for the last 8 years without our permission? It's not just CO2 emissions that we have to deal with, but we have to deal with weather modification. How is weather modification by the military destabilizing our planet's natural weather? A controversial weather modification bill was just passed. Bush just signed it to the 109th Congress. There was no public discussion. These bills did not include any agricultural, water, EPA, or public representatives, and did not have any provisions for congressional, state, county, or public oversight of either expenditures, medical, and/or environmental consequences. In other words, we've really been guinea pigs for at least the last 8 years with literally every breath we take. 7 days a week, 365 days a year. What we are breathing now, as one of my dear friends says, the indoor air is just the same. What the indoor air is just the outdoor air inside. In addition, the Pentagon is on record this summer as saying it wants to resume open-air testing of biologic weapons. There's a flyer outside on this with some research that Professor Francis Boyle has done. And he's been quoted recently as saying, the Pentagon is fully prepared to launch biological warfare by means of anthrax. All the equipment has been acquired, and all the training conducted, and most combat-ready members of the U.S. Armed Forces has been given protective equipment and vaccine. Do you know that as of October 1st, how many of you know that we are on an anthrax alert that was issued by the Secretary of Health and Human Services? Anybody know? 1 person, 2 people, 3 people.
I think we have to move along to lunch, Julia.
So I would like to say that we don't have Star Trek technology. It's just a Hollywood fantasy. Yet much of this technology is being used on us without our permission. We are signatories to no germ warfare and to the Nuremberg trials. This is our home. This is our home. Earth is our home. We don't have Star Trek technology to go to another planet. We have consequences that are moral and ethical in their ramifications, and we don't need to have any more toxins. Our planet will survive, but we will not with these staggering rates of health issues. And I ask you, do we want to live on a planet that is a sewer? Think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
As Rupert Murdoch explains, imagine if we succeed in inspiring our audiences to reduce their own impacts on climate change by just 1%. That would be like turning the state of California off for almost 2 months. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope that these issues will affect your view of global warming.